What if I told you that empires don't just randomly fall? What if enemies or natural disasters do not destroy them, but by something far more predictable, something so obvious that historians have stared directly at it for centuries without actually seeing it? Here's the real story. There's a pattern. A repeating cycle that has destroyed every major empire in human history. And the scariest part? It always takes roughly 250 years. That's not a coincidence. That's a clock. And if you know how to read it, you can predict exactly where we are right now and whether we're running out of time. Today, we will trace this pattern through the rise and fall of the world's greatest empires. We're talking Roman legions, Dutch trading posts, British naval supremacy, and yes, American dominance. Because this isn't just history, this is a warning. And you probably haven't heard this story told quite like this before, so stick around. Because understanding this pattern might be the most important thing you learn all week. Let's start with a simple question. Why does every empire think they're different? Why does every generation believe their civilization has finally figured it out, finally found the secret formula that will let them rule forever? The answer is brutal. They can't and see the forest because they re too busy counting the trees. Here's what we know from pure observation. The pattern goes like this. An empire rises. Sometimes it takes 50 years, sometimes 100. But once it reaches peak power, that magical moment when no one can touch them militarily or economically, something predictable happens. The empire starts to decay. Not because they lost a war. Not because of a meteor or a plague. But because of something internal. Something that nobody wants to admit. And that cycle? From the moment of peak dominance to total collapse, it's remarkably consistent. 250 years. Give or take a decade or two, but shockingly consistent when you zoom out and look at the data. Think about that. That's about 10 generations. That's long enough that nobody who remembers the old days is still alive. It's long enough that the institutions that built the empire have become so entrenched, so disconnected from reality, that they can no longer adapt. By the time people realize something is terribly wrong, the machinery of decline is already running at full speed. But here's the thing, the pattern isn't random. There's a reason it takes 250 years. There's a reason empires fail in similar ways. And it all comes down to one thing. Money. Not a lack of money. That's what everyone thinks. But no, it's actually the opposite. It's what you do with the money when you have too much of it. Every empire that has ever collapsed has done the same thing at the peak of its power. They've debased their currency. Now, before you tune out thinking this is some boring economics lecture, hear me out. This is actually a story about human nature, about power, and about how we lie to ourselves. Here's how it works. Imagine you're the ruler of the most powerful empire on earth. Your military dominates the world. Your economy is booming. Your people are wealthy and relatively content. Everything looks perfect, but then you face a problem. Maybe it's wars that drain the treasury. Maybe it's the infrastructure that needs maintaining. Maybe it's welfare programs that keep the population happy. Maybe it's just the basic cost of keeping such a massive empire running. Whatever the reason, you realize something. You don't have enough money. Now here's where most empires make the critical mistake. Instead of cutting spending or raising taxes on wealthy people, which would be unpopular, which would cause political pushback, they do something that feels like magic. They debase the currency. What does that mean? It means they reduce the amount of precious metal in their coins. Or, in our modern age, they just print more money. It's the same concept. You're essentially diluting the value of every single coin, every unit of currency in circulation. More dollars exist, but each one is worth a little bit less. And here's the genius of it from a ruler's perspective. The common person doesn't immediately notice. The economy seems fine, businesses continue operating, people still get paid. Life goes on. It looks like you solved the problem without any real cost. But you didn't solve the problem, you just delayed it. And you made it worse. Let's look at Rome, because Rome is the textbook example. It's where this pattern first became undeniably clear. Picture this. It's around 200 AD, the Roman Empire is at its absolute peak. Under the rule of Marcus Aurelius and shortly after, Rome controlled territory from Scotland to Iraq. The legions are legendary, the engineering is unmatched, the economy is powerful. Rome seems eternal. But underneath, things are changing. The military costs money. Constant wars, constant maintenance of the frontiers. The welfare system, the bread and circuses costs money. The bureaucracy costs money. And the taxes? Well, they were already pretty high. You can't squeeze the people much more without causing an uprising. So what did Roman emperors do? Starting around 200 AD and accelerating over the next century, they reduced the silver content of the denarius, the Roman coin. When Augustus created it, it was about 95% silver. By 200 AD, it was down to 50%. By 270 AD, it was less than 5% silver. Think about that. In less than 100 years, the currency became essentially worthless. But here's the thing, Rome didn't fall immediately. That's the trap. The currency debasement happened slowly, so slowly that people almost didn't notice. They just started seeing prices rise, inflation, lots and lots of inflation. And when inflation gets out of control, people stop trusting the currency. They stop using money for long-term savings. Businesses struggle, the economy starts to seize up. And suddenly, what looked like a sustainable solution becomes a catastrophic problem. Add military pressure from the barbarian tribes. Add political instability in the capital. Add a population that's lost faith in their institutions, and suddenly Rome falls. Not in a day, it took decades. But the clock had been ticking since they first decided to debase the denarius. From peak power around 180 AD to the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, that's 296 years. Right in our pattern. Right on the money, or should I say, right on the worthless currency. Now let's jump forward to the 1600s. Let's talk about the Dutch. Most people don't realize that the Dutch Empire was one of the most economically dominant forces in world history. They weren't the largest by territory, but by economic power. Unmatched, they controlled global trade. They had the best banking system. They were the financial hub of Europe. When the Dutch spoke, the world listened. The Dutch East India Company was arguably the first true multinational corporation. It had its own military. It had political authority. It was absolutely dominant. And then? The same pattern. In the late 1600s, the Dutch economy started to face pressure. The wars were expensive. The maintenance of their empire was expensive. So they did what Rome did. They debased their currency. Now the Dutch were clever about it. They understood economics better than most of the world, but they fell into the same trap. They thought they could manage it. They thought they were different. They weren't. From their absolute peak around 1650 to their decline into relative obscurity by the late 1700s, that's roughly 150 years of decline. But here's the important part: by 1750, they were no longer the primary economic power. Britain had taken their place. The cycle had started to turn. And how long did it take Britain to go from peak dominance to decline? 250 years. Britain's rise to dominance began in the 1700s. By 1750, they were already emerging as a world power. By 1850, they absolutely dominated. The sun literally never set on the British Empire. They controlled India, they controlled the seas, they controlled trade routes around the world. The British pound was the global currency. Everyone wanted pounds. Everyone trusted pounds. For almost 150 years, from about 1750 to 1900, Britain was untouchable. The most powerful military, the most powerful economy, the most powerful currency. It was the American moment of the 1800s. But then, and here's where it gets interesting for us, Britain started to face pressure, wars, the costs of maintaining the empire. The welfare state is beginning to expand. And they did exactly what Rome did, what the Dutch did. They debased the currency. It happened gradually at first. The gold standard meant that the pound was backed by gold, so they had to be somewhat careful. But then came World War I. The costs were staggering. And suddenly Britain was printing money. The pound was being diluted. Still backed by gold, sure, but less reliable than it used to be. And then came World War II. Even more printing. Even more dilution. And by the time the war ended in 1945, the British pound wasn't what it used to be. It was still respected, but the writing was on the wall. From 1750, when Britain rose to absolute dominance, to 2000, when Britain was just another developed nation among many others, that's 250 years. And importantly, by 1950, just 5 years after winning World War II, Britain was already in decline. The Suez Crisis of 1956 showed that Britain could no longer influence global events. America could. Britain couldn't. The torch had been passed. And most people in Britain didn't even realize it yet. They still thought they were a superpower. The cycle had completed. Again. So now the question that's probably making you uncomfortable. Where is America in this cycle? America became the world's dominant power around 1945. After World War II, there was no question. America had the strongest military. America had the strongest economy. The dollar replaced the pound as the global reserve currency. American culture dominated. American companies dominated. American innovation dominated. America was untouchable. That was 1945. If the pattern holds, and it has held remarkably well across multiple empires and multiple centuries, then America's 250-year window would end around 2195. But here's the thing. America isn't unique. So America should start showing signs of decline around 2195, minus one human lifetime. Maybe 2150? Maybe 2130. Actually, wait, let me recalculate. If the absolute peak was 1945 and the decline period is the back half of the 250 years, then America should be firmly in decline by 2070 or so. That's really soon. That's within the lifetime of people watching this video right now. But hold on, let's look at the specific mechanism. Currency debasement. Has America debased its currency? Absolutely. Dramatically. In 1971, President Nixon ended the gold standard. Before that, the dollar was backed by gold. You could theoretically go to the Federal Reserve and exchange your dollars for gold. Nixon said no, that's over. The dollar would now float freely, not backed by physical gold. That wasn't an accidental decision. It was made because, much like Britain after World War II, America was running out of gold. We were spending more than we had. We were fighting the Vietnam War, building the welfare state, and running deficits. To solve it, Nixon essentially debased the currency. He made the dollar no longer backed by anything except the promise of the government. And guess what happened? At first, nothing seemed wrong. Life went on. The economy continued. The dollar remained dominant. But the debasement accelerated, especially in the last 20 years. Since 2008, the Federal Reserve has been aggressively printing money. Quantitative easing, they call it. But it's the same thing. More dollars in circulation, each one worth less. Then came COVID-19 in 2020, and the printing presses went into overdrive. Trillions and trillions of dollars printed. Stimulus checks, bailouts. Quantitative easing on steroids, and what happened? Inflation started rising. For the first time in 40 years, inflation became the problem instead of deflation. Prices started going up noticeably. People started to feel it in their lives. Their rent was going up. Their groceries were going up. Their wages weren't keeping pace. Do you see the pattern? The same pattern from Rome. The same pattern as the Dutch. The same pattern from Britain. We're in it, right now. Now, this doesn't mean America is about to collapse. That's not what the pattern says. The pattern says that empires take a long time to actually collapse. Rome took 300 years. The decline is long. The fall is slower than most people think. But it does mean America is in the early to middle stages of a decline that could take a century or more to fully play out. And the first sign, the reliable sign that has appeared in every previous empire, is currency debasement and the resulting inflation. We're seeing that sign right now. What comes next? If we follow the historical pattern, here's what typically happens. First, the currency continues to lose trust. People start moving their savings into alternative assets, real estate, stocks, gold, cryptocurrencies, whatever they think will hold value better than the currency. The financial system begins to destabilize. Interest rates rise. Debt becomes expensive. Second, because the empire still controls the military and still has power, there's often an attempt to solve the problem by projecting power externally. More military spending, more interventions, more wars. It's an attempt to maintain dominance through force when economic dominance is slipping. Rome did this. Britain did this, and America? Well, we've been doing this for the last 30 years. Third, the domestic institutions begin to decay. Not all at once, but gradually. The government becomes less trusted. Polarization increases. People start to feel like the institutions that serve them are no longer working. They're right. Because when a currency is being debased, when the wealth is being diluted, there's less wealth to go around. Tensions rise. Society fractures. And fourth, rival powers begin to rise. This is crucial. No empire falls in a vacuum. Another power rises to take its place. For Rome, it was the barbarian kingdoms. For the Dutch, it was Britain. For Britain, it was America. And for America? Right now, we're watching China and other powers begin their own ascent. They're not there yet, but they're rising. This is just how the cycle works. But here's what really fascinates me. The pattern isn't inevitable in the way that gravity is inevitable. It's not like empires have to collapse. It's that empires choose to collapse, in a sense. They choose to debase the currency. They choose to print money to solve short-term problems. They choose to delay hard decisions. And every time, they convince themselves it will be different, that they're smarter, that they've learned from history, that they can manage it better this time. And every time, they're wrong. Why? Because the incentives are all wrong. For a political leader, for a central banker, for a government official, the incentive is to kick the can down the road. Raise interest rates and slow the economy? That's unpopular. That could get you voted out. Print money and have cheap credit right now? That's popular. The consequences won't be apparent for 10 or 20 years. By then, you're retired. You're out of the office. Someone else has to deal with it. It's a tragedy of the commons on a national scale. The individuals making the decisions face incentives to debase the currency. But the collective consequence of thousands of such decisions is the slow decline of the empire. The individuals aren't stupid. They understand what they're doing. But they're trapped in a system where short-term survival trumps long-term stability. And that's the real pattern, not the collapse itself. But the incentive structure makes the collapse inevitable. Now you might be thinking, is this just doom and gloom? Is America doomed to follow the path of Rome? Not necessarily. Here's the thing. The cycle has always played out for empires that didn't understand the pattern, but what if they did? What if leaders actually understood the historical precedent? What if they made different choices? It's possible. It's difficult, but possible. It would require three things. First, a conscious decision to stop debasing the currency. To make hard choices about spending. To reform government structures to ensure long-term thinking instead of short-term gain. That's hard. That's politically unpopular, but it's not impossible. Second, it would require an acknowledgement that the old model of empire of global dominance, maintained through military and economic pressure, is unsustainable. It would require accepting that power must be shared, that other nations will rise, and that this is normal and okay. This goes against every instinct of a dominant power, but it's possible. Third, it would require a shift in how we value success. Right now, we value dominance. We value having the biggest, the strongest, the most. But that model is what drives the cycle. What if we valued stability instead? What if we valued sustainability? What if we valued quality of life for our own people instead of projection power abroad? I'm not saying any of this is likely. The historical pattern suggests it's unlikely. But it's not impossible. And the fact that you're watching this video, the fact that more people are becoming aware of the pattern, that's something. That's at least the beginning of understanding. So let's zoom out. What have we learned? We've learned that empires don't fall because of random bad luck. They fall because of predictable patterns. The 250-year cycle is real. We've seen it in Rome, in the Dutch Empire, in Britain. The mechanism is consistent currency debasement, inflation, loss of trust in institutions, the rise of competitors, and slow decline. And we've learned that America is showing signs of being in this cycle right now. That doesn't mean collapse is imminent. It means we're in the early to middle stages of a long-term shift in global power. It means the next 100 years are going to look very different from the last 100 years. But here's the thing that matters most. Understanding the pattern gives us choices. It doesn't guarantee a different outcome, but it makes one possible. We can choose to see what's happening. We can choose to make different decisions. We can choose to adapt rather than cling to a model that's becoming obsolete. The question is, will we? That's what I want to know. That's what I want to hear from you. Are you optimistic that we can break the pattern? Or do you think we're destined to follow the same path as every empire before us? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely interested in what you think. And if this video made you think, if it made you reconsider how you see our current moment in history, then please like, subscribe, and share this with someone else who needs to understand this pattern. Because here's the truth. History rhymes. It doesn't always repeat exactly, but it rhymes. And if we can recognize the rhythm, maybe, just maybe, we can dance to a different tune. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.